After 40, your brain changes at 3 a.m., and that's why you wake up tired. You open your eyes and it's dark, but your mind is already lit up. Your heart feels slightly alert, not pounding, just awake. Your thoughts begin moving before you can stop them. You weren't dreaming, you weren't stressed, and yet you're fully conscious at 3:07 a.m. That moment is not random. It's not just stress catching up to you. It's not simple insomnia, and it's definitely not just aging. Something very specific is happening in your brain at that exact hour. Something that explains why you can't fall asleep again, why your brain won't shut off when the room is silent, why your night suddenly feels interrupted. If you're over 40, this pattern becomes even more predictable. You try to sleep through the night, but your mind starts racing. You wake up tired, even after 7 hours in bed. It feels like your system flipped into alert mode. And once you see what's really happening at 3 a.m., you'll realize this has a biological trigger. But to understand that, we need to look deeper at what shifts inside the brain right before you wake. I'm Dr. Sarah, a sleep medicine specialist with a background in psychiatry. For years, I've worked with men and women who struggle with insomnia after 40. Many of them tell me the same story about waking at 3 a.m. They're exhausted all day, but alert the moment their head hits the pillow. They want to know how to stay asleep all night without forcing it. They want their brain to finally shut off when it's time to rest. And most of all, they want to sleep through the night again. What surprises them is that their experience is extremely consistent. The clock almost always reads somewhere between 3 and 3:30 a.m. Their eyes open suddenly without noise or clear reason. Their mind begins scanning, planning, replaying conversations. Not dramatic anxiety, just quiet mental activation. They try to fall back asleep, but something feels switched on. That on feeling is the clue most people miss. Sleep science explains this pattern more clearly than ever before. This is not a lack of discipline or poor bedtime habits. It is not a personality flaw or emotional instability, and it is definitely not just getting older and sleeping lighter. The brain is following a protective sequence, a reflex designed to keep you safe under certain conditions, even when there is no real danger in the room. When people hear the word protection, they get confused. Protection from what exactly at 3 a.m. in a quiet house? There's no threat, no noise, no emergency, and yet the nervous system subtly shifts into alert mode. Heart rate increases just enough to wake you, cortisol rises just enough to sharpen awareness, deep sleep quietly withdraws in the background. This is where the misunderstanding begins. Most approaches try to calm thoughts after they start racing, but by then the process is already underway. The brain has already decided to increase vigilance. It has already interrupted the sleep cycle transition, and that decision happens before you become fully conscious, which means the trigger is deeper than the thoughts themselves. To truly understand why you can't fall asleep again, why your brain won't shut off, and why this happens more often after 40, we have to look at what the brain believes is happening at 3 a.m. Because from a neurological perspective, your system isn't malfunctioning. It's responding to something it perceives as important, and that changes everything. Around 3 a.m., your body naturally shifts between sleep cycles. This is a normal biological transition built into your circadian rhythm. For most people, it happens quietly and goes unnoticed. The brain briefly rises toward lighter sleep, then settles back down. No memory of waking, no disruption. But after 40, that transition becomes more sensitive, and that sensitivity changes everything. Hormonal shifts begin to alter nighttime stability. Cortisol becomes slightly more reactive in the early morning hours. Melatonin release may not feel as deep or sustained. The nervous system becomes quicker to respond to subtle signals. Circadian timing advances in small but meaningful ways. Individually, these shifts seem minor. Together, they make the brain more reactive at night. And when the brain becomes more reactive, it can enter what I call brain alert mode. Not panic, not dramatic anxiety, just alert. A quiet internal vigilance that feels almost neutral, but powerful enough to interrupt deep rest. That's why you wake up at 3 a.m. without clear cause. That's why your brain won't shut off once you're awake. That's why your thoughts begin moving in the dark. It can feel like a racing mind at night, even if nothing stressful happened that day. You try to relax, breathe slowly, think positively, but something underneath stays switched on. Your sleep switch does try to turn back on. The brain attempts to re-enter deeper sleep stages, but the nervous system hesitates. Cortisol remains slightly elevated. Alert circuits remain subtly active. The body is lying still, yet the mind feels engaged, and that internal mismatch keeps you awake. So the real issue isn't that you can't fall asleep, it's that something is interrupting the reactivation of deep sleep. Something is blocking the full shift back into restoration, and it's not random, emotional, or imaginary. It's a biological interference pattern. The question is no longer why you wake up. The real question is what exactly blocks the sleep switch from fully turning back on. Modern sleep science identifies this pattern as the neural sleep inhibition response. It is not a trend or a vague theory. It is a measurable neurological sequence, and it explains why waking at 3 a.m. feels so specific. This is not a disorder label meant to alarm you. It is a description of a protective reflex. The neural sleep inhibition response is the nervous system's way of increasing vigilance during vulnerable states. Sleep is biologically vulnerable by design. Your muscles relax, awareness lowers, defenses soften. Under certain internal conditions, the brain compensates. It increases alert signaling just enough to monitor the environment, even when no external threat exists. This does not feel dramatic. It feels like quiet wakefulness, like your brain simply decided to turn on. You open your eyes and awareness is already active. You may not feel anxious at all, just awake in a way that feels unnatural for that hour. That subtlety is what makes it confusing. And here's the critical part. The neural sleep inhibition response most often activates between 3 a.m. and 3:30 a.m. This is when sleep cycles naturally lighten. It is when circadian cortisol begins preparing to rise. It is when the nervous system recalibrates for morning. That timing is not coincidence. It is biology interacting with sensitivity, especially after 40 when cortisol reactivity increases. The brain becomes more likely to misinterpret neutral signals, and when it misinterprets them, it activates protection. But if there's no real danger in your room, why would the brain trigger a vigilance response at all? What exactly does it think it's protecting you from? If you can't fall asleep again after waking at 3 a.m., if your brain won't shut off no matter how tired you feel, if your mind begins racing the moment the room gets quiet, that is not a discipline problem. It is not a failure of willpower. It is not because you lack a proper nighttime routine, and it is not because you are bad at sleeping. For many people, the first reaction is self-blame. They assume they are thinking too much. They try to control every thought that appears. They experiment with breathing, counting, mental exercises. And when sleep doesn't return quickly, frustration builds. That frustration increases tension in the nervous system, which only makes the alertness stronger. But the truth is simpler and more biological. Your nervous system believes it needs to stay slightly alert, not fully awake, just vigilant enough to monitor. The neural sleep inhibition response activates quietly. It shifts cortisol just enough to maintain awareness. It lightens deep sleep just enough to interrupt restoration, and it does all of this automatically. Protection always overrides rest. From a survival standpoint, that makes sense. If the brain detects uncertainty, it chooses vigilance, even if that uncertainty is subtle and internal. You may consciously feel safe in your bedroom, but the nervous system responds to deeper signals, signals that operate below thought. That is why trying to force sleep rarely works. You cannot negotiate with a protective reflex. You cannot shame your nervous system into relaxing. The more you try to push sleep, the more alert you feel, because the brain interprets effort as activation, and activation reinforces vigilance, which keeps the sleep switch unstable. So this is not about calming your thoughts. It is about understanding why the brain activated protection. If there's no visible danger in your environment, what signal is triggering this internal alert mode? Why would the neural sleep inhibition response activate in a quiet room at 3:17 a.m.? And what exactly does your brain believe it is guarding you against? After 40, 3 subtle biological shifts begin to occur. They don't feel dramatic at first. There is no sudden collapse in sleep quality, but internally, regulation becomes more delicate. Cortisol becomes slightly more reactive to stimulation. Melatonin release may not sustain as deeply through the night, and circadian rhythm timing gradually advances forward. These changes are natural, not pathological. They are part of normal physiological aging. However, they increase the brain's nighttime sensitivity, especially during natural sleep cycle transitions. Around 3 a.m., when sleep becomes lighter by design, the nervous system is already recalibrating for morning, and that is where vulnerability increases. Because cortisol is more reactive after 40, even a small internal fluctuation can trigger alertness, not a surge, just a subtle early rise, enough to increase awareness, enough to shift the autonomic balance, enough to activate brain alert mode, and once alert mode begins, deep sleep withdraws. This is why so many people struggle with insomnia after 40, even if they never had sleep problems before. They go to bed tired and fall asleep normally, but staying asleep becomes the challenge. They wake up at 3 a.m. with no obvious cause. Their brain feels quietly active, and falling back asleep feels harder than it used to. This also explains why you wake up tired. Fragmented sleep can feel like full sleep. You may have been in bed for 7 hours, but if deep restorative stages were interrupted, the body did not fully repair overnight. The nervous system did not fully reset, and morning energy reflects that deficit. The key insight is that this is a reflex pattern, a sensitivity-based response amplified by age-related shifts. Not damage, not disorder, but heightened reactivity during vulnerable windows. If this is a reflex driven by sensitivity, then the real question becomes important. If it's a reflex, can that reflex be reduced or stabilized? The good news is this: the neural sleep inhibition response is not permanent. It is not a life sentence after 40. It is not a fixed defect in your brain. It is state-dependent, which means it activates under certain internal conditions, and it can quiet down when those conditions shift. State-dependent means reversible, not by force, but by recalibration. When the nervous system feels safe again, the sleep switch stabilizes naturally. Cortisol stops rising too early in the night. The brain stops scanning for subtle threats. Deep sleep regains continuity. And when that happens, something changes quietly. You still wake briefly during sleep cycles, but your brain no longer locks into alert mode. It transitions smoothly back into deeper stages. You don't feel fully conscious. You don't feel mentally activated. You simply continue sleeping through the night. This is where silent desire begins to form. Not a desire for sedation or knockout sleep, but for stability, for a nervous system that does not overreact at 3 a.m., for mornings that feel lighter and clearer, for the ability to trust your sleep again. That desire is physiological, not emotional. And achieving this does not require forcing sleep. It does not require shutting the brain down artificially. In fact, forcing sleep can increase vigilance. What matters is removing what keeps triggering brain alert mode, lowering the internal signals that activate protection, supporting the systems that regulate nighttime cortisol, reinforcing cues that tell the brain it is safe to stay asleep. When those triggers are reduced, the neural sleep inhibition response loses intensity, not because you suppressed it, but because it is no longer necessary, which leads to the most important question. If brain alert node is being triggered repeatedly, what specific signal is setting it off night after night? Once we understand the mechanism, the strategy becomes much clearer. You don't fight the brain. You don't try to overpower alertness. You work with physiology instead of against it. Support the nervous system gently. Stabilize what becomes reactive after 40. The focus is not sedation, it is regulation. Nighttime cortisol must remain stable. Circadian rhythm signals must stay consistent. The sleep switch needs reinforcement, not force. When those elements align, vigilance decreases, and deep sleep becomes sustainable again. That is why I recommend a doctor-approved, natural nighttime support formula designed specifically to calm the neural sleep inhibition response. It works by supporting the body's existing pathways, not by shutting down brain activity, not by creating artificial unconsciousness, but by reducing the triggers behind brain alert mode. This kind of support helps the nervous system interpret nighttime signals more accurately. It helps prevent premature cortisol activation. It reinforces internal cues of safety. It supports melatonin's natural rhythm, and it protects the continuity of deep sleep cycles, all without disrupting your body's intelligence. The goal is simple: help the brain feel safe enough to remain asleep. Because when safety is restored, the neural sleep inhibition response loses intensity. You don't wake fully at 3 a.m. Your mind doesn't accelerate in the dark. You sleep through the night more consistently. If you want to learn more about this support, it's available in the first pinned comment below. Take a look at how it works biologically. Notice what it focuses on: regulation, not suppression. Because when the brain truly feels safe, it stays asleep without resistance. But there's one deeper factor influencing cortisol timing that most people still don't understand. People who address this mechanism often notice a pattern, not dramatic overnight transformations, but gradual stabilization. Fewer 3 a.m. awakenings interrupting the night, less of that sudden internal activation, less mental movement when the room is silent, more continuity between sleep cycles. They report a quieter mind at night, not because they suppressed their thoughts, but because the brain never fully entered alert mode. The racing mind becomes less frequent. Returning to sleep feels smoother. There is less struggle in the dark, less frustration amplifying the wakefulness. Many describe something subtle but powerful. They wake briefly but do not fully surface. They drift instead of engage. The nervous system remains balanced. Cortisol does not spike prematurely. The sleep switch regains stability, and deep stages reconnect naturally. As a result, mornings begin to change. They wake up feeling more restored. Energy feels more consistent. Mental clarity improves gradually. There is less of that heavy, wired fatigue, because fragmented sleep is no longer dominating the night. Restoration becomes more complete. And this does not happen because sleep was forced. It happens because the alert signal was reduced. The neural sleep inhibition response quiets down. Brain alert mode loses intensity. The nervous system stops scanning unnecessarily. Protection is no longer overriding restoration. Sleep becomes less effortful. When the alert signal lowers, sleep becomes natural again. Not perfect every single night, but stable enough to trust. Which raises one final biological question. If this alert response follows a predictable 3 a.m. pattern, what exactly determines whether it activates tonight or stays quiet? But there's something even more interesting beneath all of this, a detail most people completely overlook. Your brain does not choose 3 a.m. randomly. There is a specific biological window involved, and it repeats with remarkable consistency, almost always between 3 a.m. and 3:30 a.m. That precision is not coincidence. This window corresponds to a circadian transition point. It is when cortisol begins its early preparatory rise, not the full morning surge, but the subtle pre-awakening shift. In a stable system, this happens quietly. You remain asleep while the chemistry adjusts, but in a sensitive system, the shift becomes amplified. When cortisol timing advances too early, the nervous system interprets it as significance. The neural sleep inhibition response activates. Brain alert mode turns on just enough to wake you. Deep sleep withdraws prematurely, and awareness rises before morning should begin, all within a narrow biological window. What determines whether that rise stays subtle or becomes strong enough to wake you? Why does it activate some nights and not others? Why do some people sleep through the night while others open their eyes at 3:17 a.m. exactly? The answer is not random stress. It is not simply aging. It has to do with regulation thresholds. There is a tipping point involved, a line between stable cortisol timing and premature activation. If that line is crossed, alert mode engages. If it is not, sleep continues uninterrupted. And that threshold can shift over time, especially after 40. In the next video, I'll explain why that early cortisol window is so sensitive, what lowers the activation threshold, and what determines whether you sleep through the night or wake up fully alert again. If you've ever wondered why 3 a.m. feels different from any other time of night, you need to understand what happens inside that specific window.